All right, everyone. Hello. Good morning. It's Tuesday, the 4th of November. Um, Tomorrow is a full moon in Taurus. And I have to admit that with all the astrology going on, this full moon in Taurus is interesting, particularly because the full moon itself, to me, seems to be happening in the midst of of a lot of stuff going on, but the full moon itself is fairly. Um, it's interesting to me, anyways, how unaspected it is by negative aspects, or it's not. It doesn't have very strong aspects. Basically, it does have sextiles in a very with a very wide orb to Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. It does have a square to Pluto with a fairly wide orb. Um, but what's interesting is that around the same time, we've also just had Mars ingress into Sagittarius, and that um, Mars is and Mercury are not aspecting the moon at all, and the Taurus is of course ruled by Venus, which is in a square to Jupiter, which we love to see it for this full moon, but unfortunately, the full moon is happening on the axis of Scorpio and Taurus, the fixed signs, and the square between Venus and Cancer is happening in cardinal signs, and there is really this creates a situation where if you use a 10-degree orb, we at least have a 10-degree sextile Jupiter, better than nothing, I guess. But what's interesting is, so just laying it out, this is a fair. It's not quite. I wouldn't say void of course, because when the moon is totally unaspected, you would say void of course. But this is, if you look at the actual, what is a full moon? It's an opposition to the sun. That's an aspect. But other than that, the direct opposition to the sun, the aspects to me look fairly weak. And it's nice that we've got a well dignified Venus and a square to Jupiter, but there is not Venus. Not only does not see the moon from this position, it's in an aversion. Venus, if you push things ahead, Venus is about to move into Scorpio. So it's what and also the moon is going to conjoin with Uranus directly before Uranus reverses into Taurus. This is the movement that I find. It's not so much the moon, the full moon on its own, that's really that interesting, but what the moon as a moment, a full moon as a moment of anticipation, a kind of a like a fruit ripening on the tree, ready to fall. And what's happening is that you can see the Uranus, the encounter with Uranus, the conjunction right at the border between Taurus and Gemini. And it's, to me, this full moon kind of represents a sort of liminal space, an in between zone, a moment of anticipating before the exchange happens where Venus goes into Scorpio, Uranus goes into Taurus, and then which sets us up. Eventually, we're going to have this Venus opposite Uranus thing with a Mercury retrograde at the end of November. If I keep going through here, at November 25th, Venus conjunct Mercury retrograde in an opposition to a retrograde Uranus, and of course we're getting way much far away from the full moon. But for me, the full moon, the emphasis on Scorpio and Taurus is really and Uranus is a kind of looking ahead to the dynamic that is going to color this moment of transition into the final stretch here of 2025. Um, what does it mean? I've told you about what's interesting about it, but what does it mean? Well, I'm glad you asked. My The Uranus, of course, is the planet that stands for revolution, for upheaval, for disruptions, and at the very least, it's perhaps, well, we've kind of got a mixed thing going on, because at this moment we have a kind of a peaceful moment before a retrograde motion puts Uranus into Venus's sign, and at that point Venus will be in Scorpio, the place of Venus's detriment. So things could get messy, basically, is what I'm saying, if they're not messy already. Um, and the thing about Uranus, you have to consider, is that Uranus is a planet most associated with the disruptions created by technology. And one of the main thing that everybody's been concerned about is AI replacing human jobs, that kind of thing. And one of the things, if I could at least try to um, come up with an analysis for this, is there's a YouTuber who I don't watch her all the time, but I appreciate the new enlightenment with Ashley, and that she came up with this concept of the economic dragon. And the idea here is that when we set the forces of the free market economy just loose in a really unregulated way, it is like a wild dragon that could be, on one hand, beneficial to those who know how to capitalize on, ride the dragon, a kind of Game of Thrones thing. But then the dragon is also kind of could be uncontrollably going around burning villages, eating people's sheep, that kind of thing. And there's something about Uranus, the revolutionary, disruptive quality, is it's kind of I feel like it's kind of like the economic dragon set loose, basically, right? And with one of the things that people were talking about with Uranus and Taurus the whole time it was there, Uranus spends about 7 years in each sign, more or less. When Uranus was in Taurus, because Taurus is the sign of the bull, the sign of, uh, you know, large agricultural animals in fields, and it has a lot to do with the sensory world of food and pleasure and things like this. That when Uranus was in Taurus, people were expecting supply chain shortages, disruptions to people's access to basic resources and stuff like that. And in some basic way, there's like, I feel like that never really manifested that much, or at least I'll tell you what, in my life, the worst that I had to deal with was there was maybe a like 6 months where I had to use a different kind of a hot sauce compared to sriracha because there was a shortage on the sriracha pepper. Okay, like I can live without goddamn a specific brand of hot sauce. I can switch my hot sauce consumption habits. It wasn't that bad, but there's some kind of problem here with with whatever's going on in the States, America, of course, the consumption habits of the Americans, and the anticipation of disruption, anticipation of collapse, and also their own businesses kind of triggering uncertainty and volatility on purpose. And the whole, in the sense, in this whole climate, you can see the authoritarianism as a kind of this anticipation, like create, like, rather than waiting for people to get really angry that they all got laid off by AI, they're just going to, like, what happens if we just like throw the tear gas at the protesters and then just cause some bullshit rather than waiting them to react, because everybody's trying to play the like three-dimensional chess like 10 steps in advance. Like, this is the problem with Uranus, is that Uranus, you have to understand, Richard Tarnas, the creator of archetypal astrology, writer of Cosmos and Psyche, said that it's actually the Prometheus archetype, which is the gift of foresight, But the gift, you have to understand, the gift of foresight could be a curse, right? Because if you have foresight, you're now cursed with this pressure to sort of enact some grand strategy 10 steps in advance. And you're like, well, we know people are eventually going to get pissed off. So I'm anticipating people getting pissed off. Why don't we just piss them off in I'm uncomfortable waiting for something to happen. Why don't we just provoke them and troll them? And this is basically what I'm trying to. I mean, I'm kind of noticing this tendency in myself as well, because we also just had Mars go through Scorpio. Mars is now in Sagittarius, and I have a lot of planets in this part of the zodiac, and I'm actually amazed that I got through Mars and Scorpio without like that much happening. I just if anything though, I like there's some kind of problem where it's like things are just like I've been taking a break off social media, for example, and I have been really appreciating just like not having any drama with anybody, not having stupid arguments, not unintentionally getting into a flame war or something like that. And it's like there's some kind of, what I'm thinking is that like peace, like if heaven existed, it would be very easy, but it would be boring, and you'd be tempted constantly that you're like, well, I mean, this is nice, it's peaceful, but I mean, I guess it's better that I haven't been fighting with people for no good reason. And so it's just like it's like in this sort of like you're kind of like anticipating something's going to happen. And so it's like this is the kind of mentality people are just they've got like the itchy, I don't want to say trigger finger, because I don't like to use weapon metaphors too much in this, but you know what I'm trying to say, right? It's that there's a moment of unhesitant anticipation where things are pretty nice, but Venus is about to turn into Scorpio, some difficult territory. Uranus is going to go into Taurus, and I think there's also in like anticipating that like I think there's a certain kind of degree of self-sabotage at the grand collective scale, because basically if we this is of course this is only from 1965 to 2020, so comparing what range of data you're sampling, and after 2020 things may look a bit different. But what I find interesting about this is that when it comes to, of course, this is just total energy consumption, but obviously there's a lot of energy consumption in China because they have so much of the industry, right? And that USA is in second place. But then if you compare this amount of energy consumption with the rest of the world, you've got extremely concentrated in these two countries, China and USA, as obviously the two main global superpowers. But it's all the other countries are very small potatoes in comparison. And then if you were to compare this, what's also interesting is that if you do this and you compare it by household, this is annual electricity consumption by country territory per capita. So it's like who has the most people, where the people are concentrated versus the energy consumption. And then obviously if you think about northern countries, Norway, Iceland, Canada, Sweden, at a per capita level, we don't have very many people living in our countries, but we consume a lot of energy just to heat our homes during the winter, I suppose. By doing this per capita thing, you put the United States down a lot farther. But then if you consider that India and India and China are competing like China's the big superpower. China's not even on the list. It's got so many people. Because China is much more efficient with like the amount of people it has, and then the amount of energy it consumes, and then the amount that it outputs in terms of resources. Whereas, so if you compare it like you've got a bunch of cold winter people heating their houses in very not very concentrated populated areas, versus in here you have one huge superpower that has the most people in the world versus America. Like there's something about there's a certain kind of imbalance is what I'm trying to suggest here, right? And then here you have household energy consumption per year, and you've got Canada and like your average household, what the home consumer consumes, and you've basically got what you consider. This is actually, I think it's kind of telling, because you've got Canada, United States, France, Japan, and UK. If you take out, I mean, Japan is the only Asian country in here, but if you look at this, what you've basically got is you've got the British and French colonies. You've got basically the colonial West as being the Western educated, industrialized, technologically advanced. This is like when if I'm I like, you know what I mean? I spent a year in Australia because I'm used to living in a very like industrialized, technological, it's Western kind of society, and it's very similar just to go to Australia if you're used to go even to Canada. But if I was to go spend some time in Brazil, Mexico, or India, it would be a culture shock, right? And this is partly due because the average person is consuming a lot less energy. And what's just odd about it is that the center, the center of what's normalized for consumption is, forget about like, I mean, if you forget about, I'm not even talking about like access to food and water and all this kind of stuff. You're talking about just energy consumption that if you had, we live in this massive peak of energy consumption that's just normalized in our society. And the China, which China consumes more energy than all these other countries, and yet per household, it's at the very lowest, right? And there's a certain kind of thing where there's this uneven differential, and this creates this whole situation where we say we won't let China sell their electric cars here because it's not fair, because we have to pay for this huge thing and they don't. Like, why not, right? Because it's like we have completely different cultural standards, and this is like the whole cultural panic that we're in, which is all it's like the whole, and we have to, America is, they don't know how to deal with this aside from let's cut the poor people's food stamps and put more money into like huge AI data centers that create even more, like, so that your China is all the way up here, but your average house, you know what I'm trying to say? It's just like, I don't know if this is what, when I think about Uranus issues and I think about protests and people getting angry and that they don't want to, like, they in order to compete with China, we're going to have to reduce the standard of living of the Americans to the Chinese to compete with them. But that's not, like, if you do that, people are going to get angry. So like, well, let's just start pissing them off to be like, before we do that, and just like have, like incite riots or something. This is basically be careful about this. With this astrology, things are pretty chill now, but it could get hectic with this Uranus retrograde. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks for watching.